Hello. Good afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and get started since it's 12. I know people may wander in a little bit late. Welcome to the LSUHS Library Grand Rounds. I'm Julia Esparza, Professor and Executive Director of the Library. First, some housekeeping. For those of you online, at the end of the presentation, you will see a link to go in that will go in the chat that will provide you with the evaluation, and then you'll get another link to actually record your attendance. You must fill out both to make sure you get credit if you're wanting CME. The data is not tied together. For those here today, please make sure you fill out your evaluation at the end of the session. We will appreciate your feedback. Today, I'm excited to introduce our speaker, Elliot Friedman. Elliot has a master's in fine arts and creative writing from Adelphi University. As a faculty member in the library, he is our research and writing librarian. He is a board-certified scientific editor with the Editors in Life Sciences. He serves as the primary writing consultant for faculty, residents, fellows, and students. He aids researchers through brainstorming, direct instruction, developmental editing, copy editing, and more. He directly assists with conference abstract, paper, journal article publications, and grant proposal editing. Today, he will be talking about generative AI and scholarly publishing. And as a speaker here today for CME, he has no conflicts.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone for being here. So, getting started, as Julie, oh my, that goes very, very quickly. As Julie said, I have no particular conflicts of interest. I do not have a financial or legal tie to any of these AI companies. Any models that I mentioned then are going to be strictly for illustrative purposes rather than endorsement. But even then, I'm probably going to keep it relatively loose because my expertise and my goal here today isn't going to be to tell you what you should be using Gemini for and what you should be using Copilot for and how they compare to ChatGPT. I will, however, disclose that I come at this as a little bit of an AI skeptic. So while I have been exploring this and utilizing it and really following some of the research and scholarship that's been evolving from it, I myself am a little bit open to questioning some of the things about AI, how we're going to implement it, how it's going to transform the work that we do as scholarly publishers. So our goals today, we're going to try and define generative AI and create a little bit of a distinction from other forms of AI that you might be familiar with in research. We're going to look at how generative AI is being used in scholarly writing and how the publishing industry is responding to that. We're also going to appraise generative AI use cases for some ethical considerations and discuss other inherent challenges and opportunities that might be part of using generative AI. So if we're thinking about creating a really nice definition, then we're going to be struggling just a little bit because the waters have gotten a little muddy in terms of common parlance when we're talking about AI. Artificial intelligence, machine learning has been part of research for decades. It goes back to anything that's helping to structurally analyze and classify different materials, different data sets. But what we're really going to be focusing on today is the generative AI that came about usually around 2022 when ChatGPT and its competitors really created an open market for consumer-grade users to interact with generative tools. So obviously, we're not going to be talking about AGI, artificial general intelligence, which is going to be that wonderful sci-fi pipe dream of a machine that well and truly thinks and that would qualify as a being or an entity in some way. But we are going to be talking about kind of LLMs, large language models, which are going to be any kind of artificial intelligence that has been trained on and can receive input from natural language. For our purposes, though, generative AI, which is our real focus, is going to be those LLMs or AI tools that can generate text, images, code, or other content based on input and prompting. So if we're looking at how most generative AI tools work, we're really looking at kind of next token prediction. Some people try and minimize this as being, oh, so it's just autocomplete from your phone. And if it is, then it's autocomplete taken to its most extreme. It breaks down whatever input it receives into smaller bytes called tokens. Sometimes that's words, sometimes that's particles, sometimes that's entire phrases. It all depends on the particular tool and how it's been set up. And then it tries to predict a plausible continuation. And I use those words very specifically because, as we'll talk a little bit later, it's not actually trying to create a true utterance. It's not trying to establish fact. It's trying to think about what the most plausible next thing it could say is. It often includes a little bit of randomness. So you can see here in this particular illustration, we have a breakdown that was originally from a scholar by the name of Ethan Mollick, where he has typed in the best type of pet is A, and you can see kind of a breakdown about what the percentages might be for what it generates next. Obviously, dog is the most common and correct answer for what kind of pet is best. I see you shaking your head back there, Monty. We will fight about this later. But you can also see personal and subjective are up there at like 19 and 18%. And what's interesting about most AI models is that there is a probabilistic element. So even though the most likely answer is dog, you're not always going to get dog. So you might get personal, you might get subjective. Depending on how high the temperature has been set and how much randomness a particular tool has, you might even get some of those really low ones like highly or domestic or subject. All of these are possible continuations, and what happens is once one of them is decided on, it becomes part of the model that is then trained to figure out the next continuation, the next token. And generally speaking, the AI cannot work backwards. So if you ever get into an argument with something and it takes a position and very stubbornly refuses to consider other things, it's because it can't really go back and reconsider. It has to work forward from whatever it generated before, with exceptions. Large language models and generative AIs are making predictions based on their training data. And a lot of the best and worst parts that we're going to talk about today come down to the fact that they have a particular corpus of training data. And for many of these tools, we don't know exactly what's included in that corpus. We can be relatively sure that most of them are trained on public domain material, which is wonderful. It knows everything that was written by Shakespeare. It knows Wikipedia. It knows a lot of open access science pulled from sources like PubMed. But most of these commercial grade tools also tend to pull from what their founders call the open web, which is to say things that are publicly available to be crawled. That can include things like Reddit, although that's now included under a partnership with certain companies. Some are using YouTube captions that they can scrub from particular videos. Basically, any site that is considered to be publicly viewable might have gotten its way into that data set. And with that in the data set, it begins to shape what the potential outputs can even be. Once it's examined all of these, it kind of transforms them into a statistical model of that text. So it's not actually storing a copy of that exact language, but it is storing like a model of how likely that particular word is to be next to that word until it creates an algorithm that really attempts to emulate human reactions in speech. The more familiar it is with the genre of text, the more stable its model becomes. And so that's why if you see something that would be really well represented within that corpus of training data, it's probably going to be something that generative AI can produce a very coherent example of. So if it needs to produce something that sounds like open access science, it has a large enough training set that it can probably do so, although whether or not it's going to have any real level of accuracy or meaning is another question. When we talk about interacting with generative AI or with most AI that receives language input, People tend to focus on what's called prompt engineering. So that is going to be deliberately shaping the input that you provide to the system in order to get the kind of output that you are looking for. So we are creating, structuring, and iterating input into the AI. You can put in extremely vague instructions into most AI if you just want to see what it says. These tend to produce relatively unhelpful, vague, or circuitous responses. So generally speaking, we are recommended to provide explicit instructions and to kind of define what we're trying to get out of it. So I'm a little bit loath in my skeptical way to anthropomorphize these kind of chatbots and generative AI agents, but we are going to have to just because of the expedience of language. Some people like to think of these AI tools as being eager to please. They are, they have a vast store of data to draw from, but they need really explicit instructions. So they are, in some ways, a little bit like students. One of the ways that you can help to engineer a prompt that has been proven to have really good effectiveness is to really start to establish context and persona. So even though, again, I'm hesitant to anthropomorphize AI, for the purposes of creating a prompt, it's often very helpful to establish what kind of answer you want that AI to provide. Who it should be basically emulating in order to provide it. So there's a difference between giving it the instructions to write a memo if you're telling it, you're the CEO of a biomedical startup versus your grant committee member versus your professional writing coach. Each one of those is going to give us dramatically different results that are often going to be much closer to the kind of feedback that we actually want and need from the tool that we're using. Once we've got context and persona, it's also very useful to give it explicit instructions about audience. Just like it's important for it to know what it's kind of supposed to be representing itself as, it's also important for it to know what level the language that it's generating should be aimed for. So if you are writing a brochure generated for an intended audience or a general audience, that's going to be something that's really different if you're writing just to programmers or to other faculty members or to other physicians. And that is actually a really interesting use case where you can target it for an audience with a particular level of health literacy or linguistic fluency or even scientific fluency. It can also be very, very important to explicitly state the format that you're looking for your results to be in. One of the more interesting ones that I've kind of run across was someone asking it to imagine that it had conducted a particular focus group and then to divide its results around a chart of particular responses. And it actually created a very interesting set of like consumer profiles. But you could also ask it to break things down into particular sections, like if you know that you want to have certain headings that are going to be involved and that might help it to shape where it's going to organize particular pieces of information. It can also be asked to summarize an argument in a certain number of bullet points or with a certain level of detail. So again, if you are going to be using this tool in a very mindful way, it's incumbent on you to know and to really think about what you want to get out of it and how you might scaffold that if you were telling a student to do something, if you were telling an associate to do something. The more readable and followable the instructions would be to another person, the more likely you are to produce something that's going to be more or less what you're looking for. So if that's kind of the basics of how we kind of interpret, use, and understand generative AI, what are its use cases when it comes to scholarly publishing, writing, and those particular endeavors? I'm not going to be talking about some of the ways that generative AI can be used to organize research or to analyze data, but my dear friend and colleague Erin Ware will be presenting a grand round of her own in the not too distant future that's going to touch on that. So if we're thinking about the ways that it can automate and take some pressure off of us with what we might think of as like non-disciplinary tasks, things that don't actually require the particular, content area expertise that an academic brings. That could be something like formatting. There are some studies that have tried to figure out how much time gets spent just on formatting for an average article publication. And the answer is somewhere between like 7 and 14 hours, which, is one of those numbers that really kind of just makes you want to stare into the middle distance when you hear it put into words like that. So it is something where it could be very helpful for helping us to format, but it could also be helpful for things like translation and lower order revision. We know that English is still largely the language of research and scholarship across the globe. That means that for researchers in other countries, the ability to write and to communicate in English becomes an equity issue. So if we have good, accessible AI tools that are capable of helping people translate from other languages, that are helping people to revise for clarity, and are helping people to sound more legible and fluent to native readers, and therefore to be more likely to be accepted for publication, it means that they suddenly have access to a whole scholarly market that they might not otherwise have been able to participate in. And if they can participate in that market, it means that we get more and hopefully better scholarship. It means that we are providing equity for other countries and locations that might not always be covered or given the same resources and advantages. And it also means that we just have the ability to bring more people and more work together. But when we think about formatting, we also need to think back to what the particular problems might be with how we prompt an AI model. And one of the big ones comes down to something called unknown unknowns. These are the things that you don't know. And in this case, the things that the AI doesn't know that it doesn't know. In this particular case, I have taken an AMA citation and I have asked this particular AI platform to give me that citation in APA. I have always been very unimpressed with automatic citation format processing on just about any piece of software, because it almost always gets things wrong because it doesn't really have the context. This is about as close to perfect as I've ever found. But of course, the problem is APA requires the use of a DOI in order to have a stable link for anything that has it. So even though it's otherwise a just perfect citation, we can't really use that. And if we didn't know what APA was requiring of us, we probably wouldn't have thought to double check that. But we can also try something else. We can try plugging in the actual article itself, in which case it is able to find the DOI and it is able to pull it in and integrate it. So how we prompt the model matters, and how we understand, think about, analyze, and take responsibility for its output also matters. So if that's taking care of some of the tasks that we might consider to be just non-disciplinary, then we actually get to the real work of scholarship. So one of the use cases that I've seen a lot of people playing around with is using AI to summarize material. I have recently been experimenting with a tool that lets me search through a corpus of articles that I've already gathered and basically provide a summary of points that I'm looking for. Control F on steroids, which has been tremendously fun and enjoyable. But I think it's also worth remembering that because how we prompt the model matters, summarizing might not give us everything that we want. It will still make errors, it will still align certain things or not focus on others that we would want it to. So for the time being, it's actually best to use these on texts that you are familiar with, because you are then in a position where you are actually able to vet the output. And even that is a pretty tremendous time saver and effort saver, because you have built a tremendous library of research that you might be familiar with. You can't always remember which one of those sources is the exact one that you're looking for. I'm sure no one has ever had that issue. It can also be useful for organizing and outlining or for identifying patterns. In this particular case, you're kind of using it to begin structuring something or to provide yourself with just a place to start, which also comes down to brainstorming. I think in general, anything that can kickstart a process and avoid what I would think of as like blank page paralysis, that overwhelming dread that comes at the start of any writing project when you've opened up a new document and you're staring at a white expanse of space and you have no idea where to begin. It can actually be pretty useful for that. In this case, I kind of like to think of it as AI as a rubber duck. If you're not familiar with it, rubber duck debugging is a metaphor often used by software engineers, where they will go line by line through code and explain what's going on, what that particular line is meant to do, to a literal rubber duck or teddy bear or unwilling hostage, colleague, friend, family member, because as we all know, teaching something is probably one of the best ways to cement your mastery over it and to figure out where the parts are that you haven't fully understood yet. AI in this case can be a really effective rubber duck because it has a lot of things that it doesn't know. And if you prompt it to be a true partner or collaborator or interlocutor who is going to ask questions and try and poke holes and need explanation, then it can often help you to figure out where those gaps are in your current knowledge base and how you can build on them in the future. Ultimately, I think the best use cases for AI in scholarly publishing are going to come from thinking of it as a co-pilot rather than an autopilot. The more choices that you offload to it, the more dangerous the prospect becomes. And I'm actually going to use the term irresponsible because you are at risk for whatever you co-sign, whether it was produced by AI or not. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But when using it as a co-pilot, when giving it instructions to point things out that you can then integrate or not integrate, I feel like this is actually a tremendously valuable tool. In this particular case, I have uploaded a version of an old article that I wrote, and it has mercifully truncated it and not included it because it is very embarrassing. And it is, I've asked it to analyze that draft and to try and give me some concrete examples of how I could make it clearer and less like it was written by Eliot of, 8 or 9 years ago. And what it does is actually fairly impressive because it has recognized that I'm using two really weird and obscure terms, pedia and ludus, in this particular article, but it recognizes that those aren't jargon for jargon's sake. Instead, it tells me to look at some other things, like where I said, "Ooh, shepherding the group towards a satisfying experience." Oh, the daggers in my heart. And it says, "Guiding the group towards a positive outcome." I feel like that's a fair cop. It also goes on to think about explaining terms clearly and then provides me with some other examples of ways that I could simplify complex sentences or shorten certain paragraphs. And while I don't agree with all of them, I find that feedback to be really useful because then I have to make myself answer questions about whether or not my writing is doing what I want it to do. Anything like this that's going to give you good things to think about, but leave you in charge of making those decisions on how to implement it and to what extent and in what degree, is going to be something that I think is a really valuable tool for scholars. And as we think about how we integrate AI, it's also important to know that this is a question that's being wrestled with in the classroom as students are using AI, sometimes appropriately, sometimes inappropriately, or illicitly, or deceptively. This particular scale is one that I really quite like. It comes from a scholar by the name of Leon Furs, and it kind of goes over a spectrum of potential AI use that you could have in a classroom. And I think that this is going to be something that we see an equivalent for in scholarship at a certain point. where rather than having a blanket reaction to AI, we start to think of it as what degree of participation is there in this particular product. So level 1 is no AI whatsoever. Level 2 is AI has been involved in some of that planning, like pre-writing, outlining, organizing things, analyzing data. Then you've got full collaboration, where they are helping to write the entire paper, where maybe you are trading things back and forward in terms of drafting. And then full AI, where if we wanted to, someone could just generate a text. The 5th level refers to AI exploration as being assignments that are only possible through AI, where you are basically guiding the student to produce some sort of AI agent or tool that is then capable of solving a problem. That's a little bit outside of our scope, but I think those 4 levels before it give us a good handrail for what we're looking at. And now we get to my favorite part, because I am, again, a little bit of a pessimist. So we can look at some of the problems that exist with AI, things to be mindful of if you begin to integrate it into your own scholarly practice. The first, of course, is hallucination. This is probably the most infamous issue with AI, and certainly the most entertaining of them. So a hallucination is going to be when an artificial intelligence tool produces some kind of nonsensical result. Often it's very, very confident about why it's incorrect. And sometimes these are things that the model makers attempt to address through creating human guardrails, which are going to be things that prevent, say, ChatGPT from teaching you how to make a bomb, or image generators from producing violence and other more hideous and abhorrent things. The problem, of course, there is that those guardrails then interact with every single model update. It's a little bit of an arms race, because if we're thinking about the metaphor of AI as a person, it's not just a student or a collaborator or a friend. It's also kind of a toddler, because the moment that you tell it to do one thing, it starts to move in another direction that you weren't expecting. And like a cat, can kind of fill the volume of any container it's put in. So this was one of the more famous examples of hallucination. Google introduced an AI summary to all of its searches that was pretty clearly not ready for prime time, because you get answers like this: how many rocks should I eat? Do we have any nutrition folks in here? Because I'm pretty sure the answer is not that you should eat at least 1 small rock per day. You would get all sorts of answers like this, like asking, how do I get pizza? How do I get cheese to stick to pizza? And the answer that it provided is glue. Some of this is afforded to the corpus that it was pulling from. In this case, it might have been pulling from certain Reddits, because people found joke threads that have been produced that were almost exactly similar to these answers. But again, it's a very confidently incorrect statement. And while I don't think anyone is necessarily in danger of being taken in by the rock diet, smaller mistakes, more plausible hallucinations might be something that could be dangerous to consumer health or information literacy, or even just trust. There was also a fairly famous issue that I believe has been resolved, where ChatGPT had issue counting the number of R's in the word strawberry, where it's only recently started to agree that there are, in fact, 3, but even then might sometimes need a little bit of prompting. And we're not really sure what's going on with that, but it is still a strange issue, a hallucination. But if we're thinking about hallucinations, we might also have to deal with the question of whether or not a hallucination is a hallucination, or whether ChatGPT and other AI generative tools are just completely uninterested in the truth. In a fairly recent article, Hicks et al., they called it ChatGPT is bullshit, because they are actually pulling from a philosophical definition of bullshit as something that is indifferent to the truth. Something that is said, and doesn't matter whether it is a lie or a truth, it is just said to say it. And I think what they really kind of get at is at the heart of the thing to be aware of, which is that they're not designed to represent the world at all. Instead, they're designed to convey convincing lines of text. And we could apply that to anything else that AI could generate, where we might say it's generating convincing lines of code, it's generating convincing images, so long as we're okay with a mysterious number of thumbs. It isn't really modeling the reality that we live in so much as creating something that seems plausible. And of course, when we're thinking about any sort of data science, the issue of bias comes in from junk in, junk out. These huge corpuses of training data from the open internet are messy and flawed, and it also means that AI models inherit the biases of any person of all the sources that they've been trained on. If you ask AI generators to produce an image of a doctor, they are almost overwhelmingly going to try and produce the image of an older white man. If you ask them to produce a president or a CEO, you're going to get a very similar result. All of these can range from things that are minor biases to major biases, but it just means that something was overrepresented in their training data, and so it's interpreted a message about the world that isn't necessarily relevant to what reality looks like or what we want it to look like either. There's also a big question about copyright, and this one actually comes down to two different issues: copyright and training and copyright and generation. So because LLMs and generative AI were trained on copyrighted material in addition to open source, open access, and public domain materials, we have to ask, does that training constitute fair use? The companies that are behind these models say that it does constitute fair use in the same way that a painter might look at a painting and take it as inspiration, or an author might read something and be inspired to write a book of their own. That's what's happening, because it's uploading this material into a statistical model, not actually copying it verbatim. There are lawsuits currently pending from organizations like the New York Times about the damages that this has inflicted and about whether or not this did infringe on their copyright. And I think it's important to note that whether just in order to cover their own legal liability, or whether it's because they recognize that there is a question about whether this is fair use, certain AI companies have started partnerships. That includes things like Time, Reddit, Stack Overflow, Associated Press, and even recently, Taylor and Francis began a partnership to allow AI companies to train on their scholarly data and publications. So if you publish in Taylor and Francis, you might be part of a chatbot now. The other issue, though, is with AI's generation and how that interacts with copyright. Now, American intellectual property is a very dense and complicated subject, and it's one that is at the heart of a lot of scholarly concerns, because we want people to own the work that they do. But the US doesn't currently recognize AI-generated content as copyrightable, in the same way that it didn't recognize a picture taken by a gorilla as being copywritten. Copyright requires an element of human creativity and authorship. So in the eyes of the Trade and Patent Office right now, it is more of a commission than a creation. If you just put in a prompt, you don't own it any more than you would own it if you hired an artist to make something for you and didn't explicitly state in the contract that you were also acquiring their intellectual property rights to it. A question that arises from that, though, is what happens when AI does reproduce copyrighted material? Because even if it doesn't exist as an exact copy inside of its statistical model, we have examples of AI producing things that are fundamentally the same as training data that it had input. And we also know that the degree to which something can be copyrighted is actually fairly atomic at times. Lawsuits about whether or not 6-note jingles are copyrightable would tell us that if you get enough AI generators producing music, there's a very good chance that eventually they're going to produce something that's copywritten. So anything that is currently produced by a generative AI might be covered in terms of your use cases by that tool's terms of use itself, but you cannot effectively own a copyright in it. You might be able to own copyright in it if you take lots of different scholarly elements that have been generated and put them into a different form. The best case that I've seen of that is someone wrote a book using AI images and AI text, but then assembled it into a complete manuscript themselves. And it was determined that the book as a whole might be qualified for copyright, but the individual elements still would not be. And something we've kind of been circling around is this idea of reproducibility, that at its heart, AI is kind of a black box. We don't know how it's working. We don't know exactly what it's thinking. And when it generates different responses based on that kind of probabilistic model, based on whether it's going to go randomly with the most likely answer or one of the answers around it, there are potential for different answers. There's not something stable that we can return to. If you're conducting a literature search in any of our tools and databases, you can create your list of search terms, you can set up all your parameters, and you can be relatively certain that if you put them in again, unless something has been retracted or published, you're going to get the same result that you had before. With AI, you might not, especially because the models themselves can change. They can change when you have a hard update, like from version 3 to version 4, but they can also change as small tuning happens or new guardrails are put into place. So even if it's just between days, you might receive a different answer, a different output. There's also a growing question about the ecological impact that AI has, because data centers are tremendous uses of electricity and fresh water in terms of cooling. It's hard to get exact figures on this because very few data centers want to confess to what their impact might actually be. Some of the more conservative guesses are that an LLM-driven search is going to require 4 to 5 times as much energy as a traditional web search. And I've seen versions of that number up to about 10 times. But then also there are estimates that by 2027, global use of AI might account for about 6 times the water that's used by the entire country of Denmark, or half the water that's used in the United Kingdom. And this is, of course, subject to that same process of exponential return, where we see more and more servers, more and more water use that can lead to either rolling blackouts in places where the electric grid is being tested, or even to droughts if those servers are in places that depend on fresh groundwater. Probably one of the biggest issues for scholarly work is confidentiality. What is that applications data policy? Because they are not the same. Some are opt-in, some are opt-out, requiring you to actually go in and say, please don't train on my data. Now, even if you can opt out of data, it's really important to think about what your responsibility is for that information being input, especially if it's bound by HIPAA or if it's bound by FERPA. Anything that you put in there, I would treat it as if, even if you've opted out, it could be exposed or compromised. We also kind of know that AI detection doesn't really work, which is a big problem for education, but also a problem for publishers. We have different tools and they have fairly mixed results, and those results are also subject to lots of false positives and false negatives. And of course, when something is as impactful as plagiarism would be for a student or for a faculty member, then almost any number of false positives is an unacceptable number of false positives. We also know that there's a very strange effect that is in play now, where even being perceived as a potentially AI-generated text makes your reader less favorable to you. There are some studies that are proposing that this is instead in the opposite direction, where we unconsciously favor text that we perceive as being human. But in either case, it suggests to me that we now have a little bit of a cop inside of our head that is judging every single thing that we read, every single image we look at, and it has to judge it in the context of living in an era of generative AI, which, I don't know about you guys, is a little exhausting, and only certain to become more so. This is probably one of my favorite flowcharts for describing my own personal thought process of AI, so much so that I've brought it in its entirety, and it's from the American Society for Microbiology, and the questions that it asks you, first and foremost, does it matter if the output is true? And surprisingly, there are still some cases where it might not matter if the output is true. If you are truly just creating like some sort of filler lorem ipsum text that needs to be written. But if it does matter if it's true, then the question becomes, do you have the expertise to verify if that output is correct? And that's again why I stress so much about using generative AI as a co-pilot, not an autopilot. If you are asking it to do something that you cannot personally figure out if it's doing correctly, then you have run into a tremendous opportunity to fall into unknown unknowns. And then finally, will you accept responsibility for errors? Because especially in scholarly publishing, you are responsible if AI messes up, not the AI. So if we're looking at how scholarly publishers have been responding to AI, the first and most obvious is that AI does not qualify for authorship. It is not a human, it is not an entity, and most importantly, it cannot stake its reputation on the results that are being presented. It cannot have legal liability if you present something that is false, defamatory, incorrect, and it also doesn't really make truly novel contributions that would really be considered human authorship. There's also an emerging consensus, though, that we are moving towards, and in many ways have already entered the era of disclosed AI. What that looks like exactly is going to vary wildly from publisher to publisher. Right now, some of the most common answers are that it's either going to be talked about in your acknowledgements or in a cover letter during submission or in the methodology, or in the case of APA style itself, it actually wants you to cite AI use in text to explain when AI has been used. Some journals are prohibiting AI material in total, whereas others are, especially smaller journals, are usually going to be kicking things up to whatever their publisher's blanket policy is. So if we look at some examples of this, Elsevier is saying that authors should disclose in the manuscript the use of AI and AI-assisted technologies, and a statement will appear in the published work. Declaring the use of these technologies supports transparency and trust between authors, readers, reviewers, editors, and contributors, and facilitates compliance with the terms of use of the relevant tool or technology. This is about as permissive as it gets, because we can look at and contrast this with science itself, where it says detailed information should be provided in the methods section, the full prompt used in the production of the work, as well as the AI tool and its version being disclosed. Again, it's not fully recoverable because we have that element of black box and that element of irreproducibility, but they still want to know which version of that source was used. Individual journals are going to exist kind of on a spectrum of how much of this information they want, where they want it to go. So it's more important than ever that if you are going to integrate generative AI into your scholarship, even just during that pre-writing stage, that you double check and make sure that it's going to be something that the journal in question is both okay with and how they want you to go about making that disclosure statement. Figures and images are being kind of widely rejected if AI generated, and the reason for that is because this came out in a Frontiers journal as part of their description of, yes, face palming is the correct response. How this got through desk review and peer review and editing is a complete mystery, but this actually did make it to publication. And it is not the sole example of this, it is merely one of the most egregious, where AI has been used to generate or to manipulate something in a way that is complete nonsense. The other major element is really thinking about AI and peer review. So while on the one hand, it could be a hypothetically great tool for summarizing complex documents or for creating feedback that you might give to authors, generally speaking, publishers are disallowing you to use AI in the process of peer review. And this largely relates back to confidentiality, because you have been trusted with a privileged advanced access to someone else's intellectual property. You don't have the right to give it away, you don't have the right to share it, so you can't actually upload it anywhere. And as a matter of fact, the NIH and the NSF explicitly and vehemently disallow it, to the point that if you do and are caught, you might basically be prohibited from ever interacting with them again, and they might take legal action against you. I did just want to touch a little bit on AI in the use of cheating, because as someone who tries to keep connected to both higher education in undergraduate education and K through 12 through a large network of educators and various resources that they provide, there is a growing trend of generative AI cheating. And a lot of it goes back to the fact that detection is unreliable. So even when a teacher can know, yes, this sounds like AI, it's hard to prove it in a way that would actually be actionable. Some people are decrying this as the death of the essay or the paper, and others are actually responding to it by going back to in-class writing assignments, blue book exams. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out, but it is a question about whether or not we are allowing people and facilitating people to not understand the work that they're doing and being asked to do. Whenever we have like a new technology, there's always a question of something like, is it going to revolutionize the world and how are we responding to it? The famous term that is often used to decry people who are skeptical about a new technology is Luddite. And if you're familiar with them, the Luddites were a movement in the early 1800s responding to the industrialization of the textile industry, because all of a sudden new machines came in that could take away the livelihood of skilled tradespeople by instead allowing large manufacturers and factories to produce stuff at scale and with a lower skilled workforce. They responded literally by breaking the machines. And so this is considered to be almost a pejorative, that you are responding from a position of fear rather than embracing inevitable change. But in some ways, the Luddites had a point. They lost their livelihood. It became an era of disposable labor that we're still kind of reckoning today in terms of like sweatshops and other labor practices that were enabled by that movement towards advanced manufacturing. So when we think about opposition to progress, the question is, when is that opposition justified? When is skepticism justified? And what better example of that for us here in education is there than the calculator? There was a tremendous discourse that the rise of the calculator would lead to the death of people's ability to perform mathematics. But what we generally found is that people have to understand the arithmetic principles behind what they're calculating before they can really successfully use a calculator to reproduce it. The question then becomes, is this particular technology going to become a calculator where they still have to understand what a good text sounds like, how something should be organized? Or is it going to become something that is more of an autopilot that we allow to make those choices for us? I don't have an answer to that question, because if I did, I would be making more money. So I have some of our references up on here, but if anyone has questions or comments, I would be glad to answer or to talk about them. And if that goes for our participants online, if you have questions that you want to put in the chat, more than happy on that as well.
Just a comment on the energy use.
Mhm.
I read recently that Microsoft is looking at opening a nuclear power plant in 3 Mile Island.
Mhm.
Reopening 3 Mile Island.
So for people online, this was a comment that Microsoft is looking at potentially opening a nuclear power plant on 3 Mile Island, reopening it as part of their effort to power servers. And I mean, I think that's going to be the question is how do we, if we're going to use AI, how do we build an infrastructure that's going to reduce its potential impact on, on the electric grid of the people around it, on the water table of the people around it, and on the climate as a whole. So I think that can absolutely be part of it. But one of the problems is when you introduce more electricity into the market, you don't always see people just build a smaller, keep things stable. They build a bigger machine. So it kind of does turn into a little bit of a Red Queen scenario of chasing that infinite growth. Oh, we have some questions. Can we use to define the databases crawled by the model when inputting the query? Generally speaking, no. The large language models that are commercially available to the everyday consumer have been trained on this vast corpus of data. We don't know what's in that particular database. They don't really either. So there's not really a way for us to specify only use this particular material. There are certain generative AI tools that have been trained with a particular database in mind. I'm thinking here about image generation because that's one of the ones that has the most ethical questions raised about it. So there are models like, I want to say Bloom, that are specifically trained on open source data, public domain data, and only on data where artists and authors have opted in explicitly. So these are tools that are trying to reckon with how we better understand the data used. But no, if you're talking about major chatbot tools, you are using the entire tool. You can't subdivide it.
I want to mention that the graduate school last year passed a policy on the use of AI in graduate school.
Yeah.
It covers a lot of the stuff you had here, but I don't know how much advertising and stuff. But so yeah, it follows a lot of the principles, right?
Yeah.
You treat it as if it's a person.
Yes.
So right, if it's appropriate to use a person to do the thing you're asking it to do for your assignment, then it's appropriate to use the AI, right? But you're responsible for it. You need to cite the, fess up to the fact that you used it and so on. So yeah, this is a really important area.
Absolutely. So for the folks online, the graduate school has actually articulated a policy last year where the rule of thumb was, even though it can't be an author, treating AI as if it was a human when determining whether or not you can use it. Because is this an assignment where you would be allowed, able, encouraged to collaborate with another human? And if so, to what degree? Which I actually really love as a very good rule of thumb for people to think about. And I actually bragged about that one to colleagues at another campus that were bemoaning a complete lack of policy from there.
Well, that's actually Stanford's policy.
Oh,
I stole it from them.
there's
Citation.
citation needed.
Yeah, that's right. We also go through this in the ethics class for graduate students. We have other things, so I'm not going to talk.
Okay. I think, okay, yes. Anyone else? David?
So my question on what they're using to train, is it all primarily English itself, or is it other languages as well? Because, I mean, we have words in English that come from other languages. So if you're not, and if you were going into music, there's plenty of music that hops back and forth between different languages in songs as well. And then just layout. So somebody has something that's all written in German, but you've submitted it in English. It's all readable, but your verbs are all off, and you're all confused. So how does that work?
So the question was, kind of what is the relationship between these generative AI models and English as the language that a lot of their corpus was in. I mean, the answer is that that's another way it contributes to the model's bias. There are some models that integrate other languages. I want to say a couple of governments have actually started open partnerships with some of these AI companies in order to train their models on their particular languages. I was just reading about one this morning and I can't remember, and I don't want to spread false information, so I'm going to refrain from trying to guess wildly and hallucinate myself. But yeah, the fact that so much of the corpus is English means that it is going to produce texts that reflect the language it was put in as.
Can I comment also about translation?
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very good.
Yes.
So I've taken a paragraph, I translated it into Hebrew,
Mm-hmm.
and then to Japanese, and then to Hindi, and then to Burmese, and then to Greek, and then back into English. And it's perfectly readable, almost exactly the same as the original. So the translation capabilities are amazing.
Yeah. And this was a comment that translation is currently one of the more impressive things that a lot of these AI models are capable of.
So one of the things we discussed at the Charleston Library Conference recently was that some of the models do struggle with characters from other languages. They can't interpret them, and so that just feeds into the language bias.
True. So this was a comment that a lot of the models have trouble with characters outside of the English language, which again contributes to their bias, contributes to what they're going to produce and what they understand when you put it in. I know I personally struggle with French accents and refuse to learn them.
That was one of the specific examples, but also a lot of non. Oh my goodness, what is our alphabet called?
Roman?
Roman.
Yes. So yeah, if you're looking at Cyrillic, if you're looking at Hebrew, if you're looking at any of these languages that don't use the Roman alphabet, then all of a sudden, yeah, it's going to have a much smaller body of data to pull from, which means not only is it more likely to make mistakes, it also just doesn't have what it needs to create like robust guesses about what that plausible next piece of text is. Anyone else? If not, then I'm just going to say thank you all for coming.
To turn in your evaluations.
Please don't forget to turn in your evaluations, and if you're online, the links are going to be there in the chat already.
Like the long way.
I was going the wrong way.
Outstanding. Outstanding. And now you're.
I'm sorry. I just got here with the.
So, within any
Sarah,
this with the
yeah.
references, is that going out, or is that going to be available for anyone, or should they just contact you if they want to actually see that sort of thing?
Yes, I am here, Sarah.
You're there? Okay. Can you just keep the chat link on there until everyone that's non-library logged out?
Yes, I can.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. I'm gonna take us out.
Okay.